isn't he? Legalisation is an important question. He was only asking a question, remember. It doesn't seem that our current setup is working.
Well, it's not working because we have laws against drug possession which are not enforced. The police and the courts do not enforce them, and the principal problem in our society is that huge numbers of people buy and take drugs. They pour into the drug trade millions and millions of pounds which sustain it, and we do nothing about it. I haven't heard anybody asking any questions about that. To ask a question in that tone is not actually to ask a question, but to suggest. And I respectfully suggest that, that this heir to the throne should not involve himself on one side of a major controversy about which he plainly knows probably rather less than nothing.
Well, he was careful not to.
Well, I don't agree. I think it is a common trick. You call for a debate when what you mean is you want to change the law. You ask a question which nobody else is asking. I don't believe millions of people in this country, especially those who live in those areas where drug abuse is rife and unrestrained by the law, want this to be made even worse. They certainly don't want to see the consequence. Legalisation, remember what it means. It means the open sale of drugs on the high street, on the internet, advertising them on television and in the newspapers. It means a huge increase in the use of very dangerous drugs. That's what it means.
Molly, no one wants to see the legalisation of drugs.
Not as Peter describes it. It's utterly and completely ludicrous, if I may say so.
No, you may not. Why is it ludicrous? Why is it ludicrous? I'm sorry.
The United Nations, last year, at their major special session, called for evidence-based public health policy. Evidence-based policy. For 50 years, we have had policy based on some kind of moral judgment that I think Peter would agree with, probably, that, you know, drugs are bad, people are bad, got to punish them. And what we've seen is the most incredible explosion in drug use since 1971, passage of
Because of the policy?
Certainly the policy has gone alongside that, so you have to ask some questions. And what we've seen from other countries, and what the UN are now very well aware, different countries have introduced different policies, much more sharp, smart than anything that Peter is suggesting, and they have reduced addiction, violence and crime. And those are the objectives that we have to look to achieve.
Well, let's talk to someone who's been on the front line. Neil, you've been fighting the war against drugs yourself. Why hasn't it been brought under control?
Well, I mean, Peter makes the point. He suggests that we've not been fighting this drug war. Well, I worked very hard I worked undercover on the streets of the UK fighting this drug war. And for something that's not been fought, I've met an extraordinary number of people who've been caught in the crossfire in that. You know, I manipulated people on the streets of our nation in order to get them to introduce me to organised criminals, in order to introduce to gangsters. And those people that I manipulated, they were vulnerable people who actually needed help. So I've caused great harm to an extraordinary number of people, and this is the reality of drugs policing in the UK. It's not true to say that we haven't been fighting this. We've been apparently. It's Peter's saying I just didn't try hard enough.
If you're going to say what I'm saying is not true, you'll have to justify that. All the statistics show that the police and the courts barely bother to prosecute the crime of possession.
Can I say that 2/3 or so of prisoners, people in prison, are there because in some way they take drugs. They take drugs and therefore they commit some...
And they are not there because they have committed the crime. They're not there because they have committed the crime of drug possession.
The answer, as in Portugal, is to spend money on treatment rather than on imprisoning people, courts, police and the rest of it.
Oh,
and
Portugal, here it comes again.
No.
Portugal this week released statistics showing an increase in drug use following this miraculous paradise which you claim has been brought in there.
Okay.
Portugal,
Molly, let Peter speak.
Examine closely. Portugal, examine closely, is not the paradise you claim it is.
They have an increase in social use and a reduction in addiction amongst young people. This is the most important thing.
Can I come in?
Yeah, let's get Peter, let's bring David in. Peter, let's bring David in. Does the current approach work?
Portugal, Molly, with due respect, has mentioned Portugal so many times in recent months. The Portuguese situation is they've just done their 4th annual survey of drug use, and as Peter correctly says, it shows massive increases in all psychedelic drugs, alcohol and tobacco. It's massive. It's shooting yourself in the foot to mention Portugal. Portugal is written off now, please don't interrupt. And it's written off. Now, I could tell you why we won't legalise drugs, and the UK is further from legalising drugs than any Anglophone nation, absolutely miles away from it. The battle's been won here by my side.
United States.
Let David speak.
And I can tell you why we shouldn't. First of all, for the listeners, some of the drugs that we're talking about actually are legal in a clinical setting. Heroin is legal in a clinical setting, and that's the place for it to stay. Nobody's suggesting, surely, that we should legalise heroin. Apparently, the Baroness is. The worst drug of all, cannabis, which is the one that causes the most harm, all the recent evidence about the teratogenic effects of cannabis are terrible. There's a new disease, there's a worldwide epidemic of something called gastroschisis, which is babies born with the umbilical, with the main intestine outside the body. And cannabis is pointed up because of the cluster effect in North America, Canada, and Carolina. Cannabis is pointed up as a cause.
OK, a few points there. Let's let Molly respond. It sounds like you're irresponsible if you listen to that.
Well, if you just very briefly to go back to Portugal, the Portuguese economy is collapsing, so they've got a number of problems. But their policy has led to a reduction in addiction, and that's really important, because all I care about is addiction. Frankly, if people want to take some little piece of drug on a Saturday night, it's a shame, and I would never do it. I've never done it myself. But the important thing for this country are addiction, crime and violence, and we need policies to reduce it.
That point is completely false. I suggest...
And the UN...
What I'm suggesting is you've not
David,
read last week's
let Molly
evidence.
speak.
And the United Nations are recognising that we have not had evidence-based policy, and they're calling on governments to introduce evidence-based policy.
The UN is
Hang on, David, we're going to come back to this debate in a moment, because we've got an interesting insight from Emma here now.
Yes, we do, because drugs can have a devastating effect on families. I'm now going to talk to two mothers who have both lost children to drug use. First, I'm joined from Oxford by Anne-Marie Coburn, whose daughter Martha died 4 years ago at the age of just 15. Good morning, Anne-Marie.
Good morning, Emma.
Could you explain what happened to Martha?
Yes, she went out on a Saturday morning and took a white powder, which we found out was ecstasy that was 91% pure, and she sadly died 3 hours later.
And did you know in any way that your daughter had been involved with drugs?
I know that the previous few months she had started to dabble, so I'd had the Just Say No conversation, I had taken her into school. I had done what any responsible parent would do, which is try to deter their child from putting themselves in danger. But sadly, it didn't work.
Do you feel then that if there had been a legalisation of drugs or certain drugs, that perhaps her life could have been saved? And in what way do you feel that?
After she died, I found her Google history, and she'd been looking for ways to do it safely. So although Martha was intent on doing it, she wanted to know how to keep herself safe. So, you know, I feel that if she'd been better educated, she'd still be alive today.
So do you support the legalisation, the decriminalisation of drugs?
Absolutely. I've spent many an hour in the past 4 years since losing Martha talking to experts. I've travelled around the world, going to lots of events to try and form my opinions based on evidence. And it's very obvious to me that legal regulation is the response that's needed.
Well, let's get a different insight here, but with a similar tale of tragedy, if I may put it like that. I'm also joined now from Reading by Elizabeth Burton Phillips, who's written a book called Mum, Can You Lend Me 20 Quid? About how drugs impacted her family. Good morning to you, Elizabeth.
Good morning.
You lost your son to drugs. In the sense of, do you have any understanding why regulation of drugs could therefore, in some way legalisation, could therefore have helped him maybe?
No. Obviously, I know Anne-Marie and I'm very respectful of her views. We're both bereaved mothers, but it is my view, coming from 39 years teaching a background and nearly 13 years working with young people, doing presentations in schools, that there is an attitude of to not do drugs is abnormal, and therefore normalising everything through legislation, legalisation, I don't think is the right way forward.
But what about the idea that if there was a way to regulate or do these things safely, I understand what you're saying about normalisation, but, you know, Anne-Marie's saying she saw her daughter's search history and she was looking at ways of doing safely the drugs that she had been interested in. Do you understand any of that as an argument for legalisation?
Yes, I do understand it. I do understand it. But, you know, it's what we have to look at here is an understanding, a really a good understanding of everybody's body is different. And, you know, as a mother, as a grandmother, if drugs are legalised, what guarantees, what regulations can be put in place to say that they're safe anyway?
Let me bring you both together for a moment, if I can. Anne-Marie, I know you can hear what Elizabeth is saying. What about the idea, then, it would normalise drugs? If we legalised it, and Peter Hitchens is here in the studio saying, well, that would mean if it was legalised, it could be advertised, it could be made normal. Do you not think there could be a risk that more young people, like Martha, if I may say, could have taken drugs because it was legal?
I'm interested in the harms of the current system, and I want those harms to be reduced. 10 people die every day in the UK from a drug-related death, and I think that sends out, you know, quite an extraordinary message about our society. I go into schools and prisons all the time. You know, I kind of, as I said earlier, I form my opinions based on the evidence that is available, and I don't believe that by educating them better based on showing them parameters under a legal regulatory model, that it would cause increase in harm. In fact, it would reduce the harms.
Elizabeth, I know you've got some agreement maybe on that point. Elizabeth?
Well, I just believe that education is the way forward, starting at the top end of primary school, before the youngsters go off into senior school. I think it's really important that the parents are educated too. It should be mandatory education to raise levels of understanding about the dangers of drugs, and that should be continuing and repeated throughout senior school. It's very, very important to give an informed, factual opinion about what drugs can do to you. And, you know, you cannot guarantee the safety of any drug on any individual body.
Elizabeth Burton-Phillips, I appreciate you joining us this morning, and the same to you, Anne-Marie Coburn. I appreciate it very much. Not easy for you both to talk about, but you're keen, of course, to share your experiences. Sean, different views.
Yeah, fascinating and really moving to hear both from Elizabeth and Anne-Marie. Peter, Anne-Marie said that her daughter Martha had been looking on the internet for a safe way to take drugs. Had they been legal and regulated, her story could have been very different. Does that make you soften your approach?
Look, I've met Anne-Marie, and I have great respect for her, and I'm sorry for her loss, but I think she's completely wrong, and I've tried to press this on her. I gave her more than a year ago a copy of my book explaining that the reason for the problems facing people like her is that the laws against drugs in this country are not enforced, and that children are therefore exposed to drugs because there is no sense in schools among young people that there is any danger from the law in taking drugs, which is the principal form of education which would actually prevent use. She won't read it. If there were in this country a cult epidemic of Russian roulette, would we ask, can we find a safe way to play Russian roulette, or would we try and prevent people from playing it? Taking drugs is like playing Russian roulette. A person who smokes cannabis may well end up in the locked ward for the rest of his life, ruining, I have to finish my point, ruining his life and ruining the life of his family. And there is no guarantee, there is no safety in regulation which would make this less likely to happen. We regulate cigarettes in this country. They're very tightly regulated. Can I not ever finish a point? We regulate cigarettes in this country. We regulate cigarettes in this country very, very tightly, and people still die of lung cancer and die of heart disease and emphysema because they smoke them. Regulation does not make a dangerous product safe. All people, we are sitting here in this room now because billionaires have for 20 years been pouring millions of dollars and millions of pounds into a huge campaign for the legalization of drugs, from which greedy, cynical people hope to benefit. Don't smile at this. This is what is going on. And you, the BBC, are constantly plugging this.
No, I'm not smiling at it, but if you make your point very long, no one else will get a chance to make
I didn't come here to be quiet. This is a very urgent problem. Posing the question in the way that you do always sets the argument on the side of legalisation as the default point, and puts people like me with the sane and rational position in the dissident minority.
OK,
that's
you've
how
made
you do
your point.
it.
Neil, respond to that.
Well, I'm from an international organisation called LEAP. In LEAP UK, we are growing rapidly, and we're all people who have seen it from the law enforcement perspective. We've seen how the law destroys people's lives. We've seen how... And certainly, sometimes I listen to you on this topic, and I think you really need to spend a lot more time with people who use drugs, because you might actually get a different perspective.
Oh, don't patronise me, please.
Well, I've spent a lot of time... It interested me how the Duke actually spoke to people in recovery, because I recognise... his thoughts, I recognise his empathy with that, because I've spent an enormous amount of time who are problematic heroin users. I manipulated them. I was part of this big machine which just cast people aside.
Drug taking is not a disease. Diseases are
how you
compulsory.
define it.
No, listen, diseases are compulsory. Drug taking is a voluntary act.
Okay.
If you want to be an advocate
for
drug abuse, be one.
Peter, you've had your say.
But make it clear that's what you're being.
I'm not trying to define addiction. It's a very complicated issue with many complex causes. But the law does not put people off. I mean, you mentioned
because it's not enforced.
You say that. You say that, but in 2013 we reached a record number of people for possession in our prisons. It hasn't dropped off.
No, we did not.
Yes, we
did.
No,
we did not. There's hardly anybody in our prison for simple possession.
And yet,
1979.
Okay, Peter,
I have sent plenty of people. I have sent plenty of people
for simple possession.
For simple possession. And let me quote you this very interesting.
I don't believe that.
Okay, make this your final point, Neil.
This very interesting fact.
Give me an example of a case.
Very interesting.
Neil,
one in five problematic heroin users tried heroin for the first time in prison. So it's not exactly very beneficial sending people to prison for possession, then, is it?
Well,
that's just piling trauma on top of trauma.
That's because we're as weak on drugs in prisons as we are in the outside world.
Prison's not the answer
someone else
for the 21st century.
Okay, Molly.
Can I respond to Anne-Marie Coburn? She's brilliant on these issues, frankly. No child wants to die. No child wants to die. If only, they say, children, we could see on the packet exactly what is in this drug. Then I would feel safe and I would know I was safe because I'd bought it from a safe place, not from an illegal drug dealer, and I'd know what was in it. So that's point one. The second point, the Netherlands that have regulation of cannabis have far lower levels of cannabis use than we do.
If we look,
oh yes, they do. They enable you to take.
It has toleration, which is a different thing.
Molly, very short point now because we're.
And heroin, Swiss provide clean heroin to heroin addicts, and 2/3 of them are leading legal lives, not taking heroin from illegal drug dealers or anywhere else within 18 months.
And we spend millions of pounds on giving methadone to drug
Molly,
dealers.
right, finish your point.
So we need to not heroin in supermarkets, heroin in clinics where people get really good wraparound treatment and they get better.
Okay, that is Peter. That is all we've got time. Peter, that is all we've got time for. A really lively debate and a really good one. Thank you all very much indeed.
You didn't frankly have the balls to put country before party.